Okay, everyone. So thank you for joining us this evening for this iCatch meeting. And I'm delighted that Neil Reid can join us this evening from Queen's University. I've known Neil for a long time, probably longer than we'd care to admit. But when Neil is not going around Lough Neagh now up to his knees in sludge, we've worked together on freshwater pearl mussel conservation projects, which I know Neil has a big interest in. But I think it's fair to say, Neil, your love is really for the Irish hare. It's probably
Yes, full disclosure, I'm really a terrestrial ecologist and a mammologist at that. But I dabble in a whole lot of things, birds, invertebrates, Lough Neagh, various things of conservation interest to the island of Ireland.
I might add to that, Neil, bringing forward next generation of budding ecologists and conservationists. So, lecturing at Queen's University in keep me right now, conservation biology.
So yes, I'm the program director for an MSc, a master's course in ecological management and conservation biology. So we have usually 30 to 40 postgrads coming through every year now in that program, and it's grown quite considerably over the last 10 years, which I think demonstrates the increase of awareness and interest, particularly amongst the younger generation on biodiversity loss and climate change more generally. So yes, it's quite nice then to encounter graduates later on when I go to various meetings and go, oh, you're here working on this now. So it's quite nice that it's feeding graduates into the conservation sector.
Every year, those MSc students get ceremoniously dragged through the Ballinderry catchment and see the freshwater pearl mussel breeding program. So it's great that we can connect research to practical conservation on the ground. I think that's really important. So I'm not going to stand in the way of Neil any longer. We've asked Neil to speak about the research he's been doing on Lough Neagh and the cyanobacteria blue-green algae crisis. So Neil, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark. Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak about Lough Neagh. As Mark says, I'm a conservation biologist. So I've been working in Queen's for about 20 years, and I do a variety of things from badgers and bovine tuberculosis through to we're just finishing off the National Otter Survey North and South. And in fact, today I was just finishing off the Northern Ireland Crayfish Survey. So there's a bit of aquatic things in there that I do, and I'm particularly interested in species of conservation importance and relevance and designated sites. I'm originally from Lough Neagh myself, so I'm from very close to Lough Beg, Church Island in Lough Beg, to the north of the site. So it's of personal interest to me, and being the largest kind of contiguous intact ecosystem that we have in Northern Ireland, when the blue-green algal bloom started in 2023, it was something I was particularly keen to be involved with and to try and figure out exactly what was going on. So I won't spend too long telling you things that you already know, so I'm going to skip over the introduction to Lough Neagh fairly quickly. We all know that Lough Neagh is very large. It's probably a lot larger than you imagine it is. It's the largest lake in both the UK and the island of Ireland. And to put that into context, I suppose Windermere is England's most famous lake, and it's 26 times bigger than Windermere. So it's a big old body of water. It drains 43% of Northern Ireland and some of the Republic of Ireland, Cavan as well, and it provides 41% of our drinking water, so strategically very important for the population. And from my perspective as an ecologist, it's an important protected site. So it's designated at various levels. At the EU level, it's an SPA for overwintering wildfowl. It's an SAC for various wetland habitats. And at a local level, it's an area of special scientific interest, in ASSI, for all of those particular features. It's also important economically. We have a very large eel fishery on the lake and a scale fishery as well, and various businesses around the lake that is dependent on it. My interests are largely ecological, so just to show you a couple of interesting things about the lake itself, I suppose. Lots of interesting terrestrial wetland habitats around the edge. And so here we have Irish lady's tresses, which is a rare wetland orchid. that's fairly restricted in its range. It's found in only very small patches, and here you can see it totally rings Lough Neagh. So Lough Neagh is a particularly important site for this species of flower and for the habitat that it lives in. It's designated for its overwintering wildfowl. So we have 4 different diving ducks that migrate south and spend the winter in Lough Neagh: potchard, goldeneye, tufted duck, and scaup. But all of those species have undergone dramatic declines during the last 20, 30 years all across the UK, including Lough Neagh, where it's designated for their overwintering numbers. So Lough Neagh should really look like this in the winter. It should be covered in huge rafts of diving ducks, hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of individuals. And it's really this which was the portal for me to get into Lough Neagh research. So early on in my career, I had a PhD student who was studying the wildfowl in Lough Neagh. And here we did a study back in 2012 where we amassed all of the overwintering bird counts, the webs counts, and we analysed those. And what we found was quite startling, that the duck population, the overwintering duck population, was fairly constant up until about the winter of 2001. And then there was this very dramatic and very clear regime shift. There was a collapse in the overwintering duck populations, which have remained low ever since. So those huge rafts that we would have seen are now a much rarer sight, and there's fewer birds there. And so we started asking the question, why is this the case? It turns out that it's really to do with climate change, that Scandinavian countries, Norway, Sweden, Iceland, from which these birds come and overwinter here, they don't freeze now the way that they used to. And so there's plenty of open water in those northern latitudes. So if you don't need to fly all the way south to Lough Neagh and you can still have an ice-free lake in the north, why bother doing so? So those populations in the north have seen a 3,000% increase in overwintering numbers, and we have seen a dramatic decrease. So it's not that the ducks have disappeared, it's just that they've redistributed due to climate change. And that's a really thorny problem, because how do you manage a site which is designated for these species when you have no real control over the things that are going on? But we're also interested, is there something changing in the lake at the same time as this collapse in the duck population? And we also studied the Lough Neagh midges. Very famously, the lough has these chironomid midges. They live in the sediment as small larval grubs, and then they metamorphose and they hatch in kind of May, June, and they create these fantastic whirling clouds of what look like smoke from a distance, but they're really millions of individual flies, and they're well known to those of us who are residents of the lake. We in the early, 2010, we went out on boats and we took a core sample, and we took cores of the mud at the bottom of the lake, and we then counted all of the chironomid midges and the different species that live in the mud. And you do that by looking at the shapes of their heads. They're all diagnostically shaped. And we repeated a survey that had been done in the late 1990s. And so what these two graphs show is, you can just see that the bars on the right-hand graph, 2010, are far smaller than the ones on the left-hand graph. Between the late 90s and 2010, there was a collapse in the chironomid population. There was about 80% less chironomid midges in the bottom of Lough Neagh than there previously had been. And that was largely to do with actually improvements in water quality. During that period of time, we had seen a decline in chlorophyll A concentrations. The lough had got cleaned up because it had been very polluted over the 70s and the 80s. The Water Framework Directive came in, and there was reasonable traction and improvements in water quality. And that meant there was less nutrients, less algae, less food for chironomids. So in fact, less chironomids might be more like the way it should be than large clouds of chironomids, which are fed by this productivity. But we saw a huge change in the ecosystem of the lough during these early years. So not just ducks, also invertebrates. And this is important in the wider context. The lough has a chironomid, a coragonid whitefish, the Lough Neagh pollen, which is dependent on these flies, and its populations have also collapsed. And of course, it's home to the critically endangered European eel, which is also dependent on these larvae. So the system's quite interesting, and this is really what we want the system to be like: a nice clean lough, people swimming in it, using the water, water sports, angling, wildfowl. And of course, in 2023, we had this huge algal bloom that occurred in the middle of the summer. In fact, it lasted for most of the year. And so it was really very dramatic. the lake got covered in this green sludge, and particularly around the edges, you get these huge, thick, what we call algal mats. That really is where it accumulates and hasn't been broken up by the wind yet. And it really stinks, and it's very unpleasant, and it uses up all the oxygen in the water. And the blue-green algae is actually a bacteria rather than an alga, so it's not a proper plant. It's a photosynthetic bacteria. It liberates a number of toxins which get into the system and are not very pleasant, and I'll come back to those. So this is what it kind of looks like. You get these huge ribbons or aggregations of algae that kind of tumble through the water. It's a very shallow lake. It's very wind-driven. All of this basically gets blown from the west to the east, and it banks up hugely in places like Antrim Bay, Lenamore Bay, Kinnigo, Marina, places like that. So it's not very pleasant. This was a photograph doing the rounds at the time. Lough Neagh is emptied by the Lower Bann River, and here is the bridge at Toom, and you can see just how green the river was compared to the grass around it. On satellite images, it almost completely vanished. So very startling. Lots of evidence of potential impacts. Certainly I was seeing dead fish when I was out in the loch. Dead wildfowl have been photographed. There was a potential case of a dead otter. We had water sports companies closing down because of the risk to human health. And of course, we then had all of the issues that we've seen over the last 2 years, starting with a kind of a wake for Lough Neagh, that Lough Neagh was dying in plain sight. And we published an article in the journal Nature to try and get the message out into the international community that something was happening in this important lake. So I decided that I would go out and try and see what was going on. So I scrambled a rib and a boat, and I went out on Lough Neagh and spent a couple of days, really not very long, collecting water samples. And this is a study that we published just in the summer past. So this is the satellite image of September 2023, and you can see the green ribbons in the water. We can take that image and we can subject it to various spectral analyses in the computer. And the image on the right-hand side, the dark green is concentrations of algae, the light green is cleaner water. So you can see that in August 2023, and that basically the entire lake was stuffed full of this blue-green algae. There was virtually nowhere that was untouched. You can see all the dots there are places that I visited in a boat and took water samples, and around the edge took algal mat samples. This is Toom Loch at the time that we were going through it in the rib, and you can see that it's completely stuffed full of the algae. Really unpleasant smell down in there. The lock keeper was saying he was going home every evening with headaches, that local people were complaining it was making them feel nauseous. Really unpleasant stuff. So collecting this material, and you can see various concentrations from left to right there of the algae. So what did we do with these samples? Well, we subjected them to laboratory analyses, which I'm not going to bore you with the details of. Suffice it to say now, we can extract all of the DNA in the water. We can read every bit of DNA in that water, and we can then match that against online databases to identify all of the DNA that we can possibly find. And we found 31 different species of bacteria that we were able to quantify and say how much they contributed to the overall amount of DNA. So, I'll not go into the details. Suffice it to say, modern scientific technology is fairly indistinguishable from magic these days. I won't go into explaining a lot of the graphs here, except to say that they're there to remind me what to say. But essentially what these show is the communities of bacteria in the water and what they're made up of. So in the left-hand graph, you can see a little cluster of gray dots, and those are all water samples. And because they're really tight together, it tells us that all the water samples had very similar bacterial DNA communities. And those were very different from the triangle of black dots, which were the algal mats, the big sludgy messes around the edge. And they were made up of very different bacteria. So the water has different bacteria to the algal mats. And when we ask what's the difference is that the algal mats around the edge have other things in them other than algae. So the water has the algae, and the algae is Microcystis aeruginosa. That's the main species. So 33% of the bacteria in the water is algae. But around the edge, all that algae builds up and it dies, and then it has to get decomposed by something. And all these other bacteria in the water come in to decompose that dead algae. And those bacteria are E. coli, Salmonella, Clostridium, Enterobacter, things that belong in gastrointestinal tracts, so feces, poo in other words, and it comes from livestock and from human. These are naturally in the environment, of course, birds are pooping these things out as well, but the sheer volume of it there and the dominance that we see in Lough Neagh suggests it's probable that it's coming from other sources, livestock and human sources, and I'll come back to that. The other graph shows us the water, grey being low algal densities, black being high algal densities. Suffice it to say, when there's a lot of algae in the water, the bacterial communities are very different. They're shifted, and lots of different bacteria bloom at the same time as the algae. So when we go through all of this, what we find is 13 species of potential human pathogens, things that will make you ill. So when people are in the water, maybe they're kayaking, they go into the water, they're handling ropes, boats, you're touching your face. Very easy to get this stuff contaminated into your mouth. And as we all know, those things will give you a very nasty tummy bug at best. And at worst, they can do a lot worse with people who have compromised immune systems. So this is not stuff that we really want to be in our environment. To make matters even worse, then the algae itself produces a range of what we call cyanotoxins or microtoxins. So here we've got a list of about 13 different toxins that we detected in the lake itself. And the ones in yellow there, the top ones, these are ones that exceeded the World Health Organization's recreational exposure limit. So this is what the World Health Organization is saying: you should not be exposed in the environment to this level of these toxins. These particular toxins they get on your skin, they might cause you a minor rash. If you ingest some of it, it might make you feel a bit peaky and a bit sick. But actually, ingesting not a very significant amount of it can be quite dangerous, in that these are neurotoxins. They interfere with electrical activity in the brain and the neurons in the liver as well. And so these can lead to death in mammals really quite swiftly. And they also get into our drinking water. So the drinking water is, of course, purified. The Northern Ireland water have released levels of toxins in the water, and they are orders of magnitude below the legally allowed threshold for these things. So absolutely, the water is safe to drink. However, MCLR, one of the toxins, is a carcinogen. And I don't know about you, but I want 0 carcinogens in my drinking water, not even a very small amount. Now, there's a separate issue. These are toxins. In autumn, the algae breaks down and it liberates a group of chemicals called geosims. And these are kind of strong smelling, earthy, composty, mushroomy smelling compounds. And so this autumn, a lot of people in Mid-Ulster, my family included, were complaining that the water smelled really bad. It tasted really bad. You get in the shower and all the steam begins to smell, and you can smell these geosims. It smells earthy and composty and not very nice. Actually, the geosims they present no human health risk. They're just really about the unpleasant smell. Whereas it's these things, these toxins, that present a significant risk to human and animal health. And certainly we saw a number of instances of dogs allegedly entering the water and being dead by the evening. Now, if these things are true, and of course they were not tested for toxins, but it's not consistent with a bacterial infection that takes days or weeks. This is consistent with something very fast acting like a neurotoxin. And so if the dogs had drank enough of this laden water, this is what we could imagine happening. So it's very consistent with the presence of these toxins. We also measured the nutrient content of the water, and it's phosphorus that largely drives the algal bloom. So when you've got a lot of phosphorus relative to nitrogen, it favors cyanobacteria, and the amount of phosphorus in Lough Neagh is in the very highest category of nutrient pollution of fresh water. So it's what we call hypertrophic. We confirmed that, as we've known for many years, Lough Neagh is hypertrophic, where you've got a lot of phosphorus, you get a lot of blue-green algae. One drives the other. So it's really about nutrients, and we know that about 60% of the phosphorus in Lough Neagh is coming from agricultural sources. another few 10% potentially from human wastewater treatment works. Over the last 100 years, these are data for the numbers of livestock in Northern Ireland as a whole. We've went from 800,000 cattle to 1.6 million. We've went from 400,000 sheep to 2 million. We've went from 6 million chickens to 25 million. There has been an enormous increase in the amount of livestock being produced over the last century. There was a recent study published suggesting that we produce 1 million tons of animal manure every year in Northern Ireland, cattle, pigs, and chickens. I then did a back of the packet calculation and worked out that we probably produce about 300,000 tons of human feces. So we produce 1.3 million tons of feces, which, given we've got a population of 1.9 million people, is about 670 kilograms of feces per year, or 8 times your body weight of feces every year is produced in Northern Ireland, year after year after year. Where does it all go? Well, it has to go somewhere. The human waste obviously goes to wastewater treatment works in the Lough Neagh catchment. We've got 70 wastewater treatment plants. We've got 10,000 septic tanks. All of our bungalows in our widely dispersed rural housing stock will have septic tanks. A lot of them will be old. They'll be leaky. They'll not be emptied very often. That's producing a leakage of nutrients in groundwater. And then our agricultural, and when we get large downpours of rain, these wastewater treatment works that deal with a lot of this waste can't store all that water, so they simply have to let it go, and it goes down our rivers. So we know that this is a huge problem all across the UK. So in addition to all that nutrient, which is fueling growth, we also have non-native species in the lough. So we have zebra mussels. These come from the Pontic-Caspian Sea. They arrived in 2005 in Lough Neagh. They've now become very numerous in some areas, and they filter feed constantly. And so these things pump vast amounts of water, and they eat green alga, which is very nice and doesn't have any toxins. And they essentially, for want of a better word, spit out the blue-green algae in their pseudofeces. So you end up with lots of blue-green algae in the water. Very few competitors. The water becomes really clean. It becomes clear. People look into the lough and say, my goodness, isn't it beautiful? It's really clear this spring. Well, actually, Lough Neagh should be pea green soup. It should have a lot of plankton in there. Shouldn't be clear. So lots of clear water, huge amounts of light penetrating deep into the lough. All that there is blue-green algae, and it's being fed loads of nutrients. Also, we have the problem of climate change. I put a slide in earlier and it's disappeared. We have had an increase in air temperatures over the last 20 years of 1 degree in the catchment, and the water in the lake has also increased by 1 degree over the last 20 years. Doesn't sound like a lot, but it means those peak temperatures in summer are getting right up into kind of 17, 18 degrees. I mean, you could kind of keep guppies in that kind of water. So heat, nutrients, and light, the 3 things that any photosynthetic organism needs. Boom, it's the perfect storm, and that's what creates the blue-green algae, and that's what's happened over the last couple of years. We also had, in 2023, we had our wettest 18 months on record. We had that terrible wet summer, so just huge amounts of water flushing the lough with even more nutrients than it would otherwise have. So that's what's brought this to the fore. These zebra mussels become enormously abundant. They utterly change the ecosystem. So here is a picture of the woodland floor at Ray's Wood, and it's basically just a shell beach in a woodland. It's really quite remarkable. So it's utterly changing everything below the surface of the water. It's creating all these reefs. It's utterly changing the plankton by filter feeding, and it's even changing the surrounding terrestrial environment. So in our paper, we tried to create this conceptualized diagram of the lough and everything that could possibly be driving the blue-green algal blooms. And it's mostly, as I say, septic tanks, cattle grazing, uplands not having enough trees on them, slurry, deforestation creating sediment, and all of this is going in and affecting the lake and affecting all of the things that are on the lake. So it's really that kind of perfect storm. I'm very pleased to say that over the last 12 months, it certainly seems to be be gaining traction both with the public. People are aware of it. People are commenting on their drinking water. There's a health issue there. It's about recreation. There's been quite a lot of activism around the subject, and as a result, we've had really quite good engagement, I think, at the political level. So the minister has been very engaged. We've had our Lough Neagh action plan signed off by the executive. We have had some money released in order to get some research projects going to try and remediate the lough, and we've had a number of other events recently, like the one Mark was talking about yesterday, to talk about what are the solutions and how do we mobilize those solutions. Of course, the real problem here is that as a country of 1.9 million people, we're producing enough food to feed 10 million people, and most of that gets exported, which of course is great for the economy and GDP, but there is a cost in the production of that food, and the cost is the poor environmental regulations around some of what happens in the countryside. So what are the solutions quickly? Well, I'm going to run through 4 or 5 different things that I think are useful and valuable. This is as the minister keeps saying, this is a problem decades in the making. It will be decades in the solving, but there needs to be a staged approach. And so DERA, for example, have had their recent small business research initiatives to try and get projects to remediate the issue immediately. So these are quick fixes. Is there something that we can do in locations like marinas, places where people aggregate, where we can clean up the blue-green algae so we minimize contact with it in the immediate next few years? And so there have been 5 projects that have been selected for phase 1 of this, and they will be trialing different technologies over the next 6 months. 2 will be selected to go into phase 2, and then 1 will eventually go into phase 3 and be implemented. I'm very pleased to say I'm involved in one of those 5 successful projects, and it's called Aquaphage. And this is I think it's a very interesting project, but you have to get the optics of this just right, so it's not to cause concern. And that is blue-green algae, bacteria, get viruses and get sick just like we do. And they get viruses called cyanophages. And what we have done is we have sampled Lough Neagh, we've cultured the blue-green algae, and we're extracting the naturally occurring cyanobacterial viruses. And the idea is that we're going to culture those en masse to create a liquid, a solution, which then can be applied as a biocontrol agent. Now, I do this in my garden. Every spring I buy a sachet of little powder and I put it into my watering can and I mix it up. And these are eggs of a nematode worm that gets into slugs, and it causes the slug to explode, and then more nematodes go on to infect more slugs. And it's a biological control for slugs without having to use toxic chemicals. And so this is much the same thing, using a naturally occurring agent, natural biocontrol to control the toxin, put it in the spring, keep the population of blue-green algae low. It's self-limiting. When the population gets really low, there'll be less virus produced, and the virus disappears once all the blue-green algae disappears. And it's also very specific only to blue-green algae, doesn't infect other things. So whilst we might all have seen the film Contagion, there is no genetic engineering, there is no creation of life here. This is using naturally occurring agents for biocontrol. Short-term solution, perhaps, and we don't know whether it'll fly yet. But the things that really make a difference are wastewater management, looking after our wastewater. And here I wanted to flag up some work that the Ballandale Rivers Trust does. And so as part of their water-friendly farming scheme, getting a handle on really basic technologies, spouting, guttering, making sure that drains have got lips around them so farmyard waste can't get mixed with rainwater waste, making sure that places where farmers use pharmaceutical compounds in their cattle crush has overhead shelter from the rain. These are really boring basic things, but these are really important for controlling the amount of runoff from farms which is getting into our rivers. And that's the kind of great work that we need to see. Similarly, making sure that we don't have access of cattle to the main river channels. So I've just finished the Northern Ireland Crayfish Survey. We have looked for the DNA of crayfish in 110 sites. And what we found was that there was far fewer crayfish than we would expect in sites where cattle had access to the waterway than where they didn't have access to the waterway. So 60-something% of sites where there weren't cattle had crayfish, 40-something% of sites that had cattle in the water did not have crayfish. This was a highly statistically significant effect. And cattle, went out of 110 sites, half of them had cattle being able to access the water, which is an enormous number. So making sure cattle can't get into the rivers themselves, giving cattle alternative drinking water supplies, making sure that lanes aren't being cut up and all of that mud being washed down into the rivers. These are low-tech, low-cost solutions, maybe not the sexiest of solutions, but these are the solutions that every single farm needs in order to lower its ecological footprint. We also have technological fixes. So there's recently been an injection of £4 million by DERA into a large slurry project. We produce a lot of slurry. This can go into anaerobic digestion. So you put it into large vats, they heat up, they liberate a lot from bacterial activity, they liberate a lot of heat and energy. You can produce electricity. It's a circular economy, reusing waste, and the product at the end of it has got less detrimental nutrient in it than the slurry that went in the first place. So yes, there will be technological solutions, but as I say to my students, these problems were created with old technology and we can fix them with old technology. We don't need a magic man from the stars to come down and deliver new technology. And I'm very keen on the oldest technology and cheapest technology of them all, and that is nature-based solutions. And so there's a range of these that we're keep harping on about in our department in Queen's, because we want to see these used at large scale. So things like, for example, drainage swales. So every farm in Northern Ireland has got a boggy, wet bottom of a field somewhere that isn't hugely agriculturally productive, and is usually, it's a real effort to get any production out of some land. In those areas, you could, for example, have willow planted, a few tens of square meters, or reeds could be planted, and the wastewater from the farmyard can be rerouted into those areas, so that when there is a flood and you have to release some water, it goes into the drainage swale, it slows down the passage of the water, and the nutrients get taken up by the trees rather than arriving at the river. Virtually none of our riparian corridors in Northern Ireland, or any of our rivers in Northern Ireland, have a riparian corridor. We farm right up to the water. Cattle often get right in the water. And so what we need is, again, it's not a huge sacrifice of productive land. A few meters, 2-3 meters either side of a river channel needs to be fenced off to prevent access from cattle. It needs to be allowed to revegetate, so it becomes a physical strain, and it's straining out that sediment before it gets to the river. And then on the productive field on the inside, we need a small margin of uncultivated land as a buffer, that you don't plough right up to the edge of the river. And this, again, would vastly decrease the amount of nutrients getting into the likes of Lough Neagh. If you go up into the Sperrins around the Lough Neagh and up into the Antrim Hills, you'll find the mountains. And curiously, there's virtually no trees up there. We've removed them all over time, and now we keep herds of sheep up there, which keep any small saplings eradicated from the landscape. Water, therefore, runs through the gullies of the peat, erodes the peat gets in the rivers. All that water arrives at the river at the same time. If these mountains were forested, as they should be, all of that water would be slowed right down. The percolation of that water would be slowed right down, and it would prevent downstream flooding, causing a lot of soil erosion and contamination of our waterways. Similarly, our peatlands are in a terrible state. A huge amount of our peatland has been historically extracted for turf and then left high and dry. So we get a lot of this kind of peat erosion, these deep peat gullies, and then when water does come through here, a lot of peat are getting into our waterways. So restoration of these peatlands, the re-wetting of these peatlands, putting in coir bungs, getting it back into a functional state so that it begins drawing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So it's a fix for carbon for climate change. It's good for biodiversity. It supports bogland plants and animals, and it will then improve our water courses by reducing peatland erosion as well. So how do we do all of these different things? Because that's a lot of action that needs to be taken on literally every farm in the country. Well, of course, we do have things like agri-environment schemes, which can be useful in channeling some incentives to get farmers to adopt this sensible practice. My worry about this is that if you look at the environmental farming scheme around Lough Neagh, yes, there's quite a good uptake. We've got several hundred participants there, and it's great to see so many patches on the map. But if you look at that as a percentage of the overall screen there, it's still a very low percentage. And frankly, every farm needs to have good waste management, good water management. These are not radical things to be suggesting that we need. This should just be business as usual. It shouldn't be business as usual. It should be business that is usually clean and tidy. It shouldn't be the way it currently is. So we need it rolled out on every farm. And how we do that and how we get people along on that journey is the challenge to nudging behavior. And that's really going to require, A, the farmers are absolutely essential. They are the solution to the problem. Government is in control of the levers and some of the money and the policy and the direction. And then we all need to work together with conservation organizations, such as those on the screen and around Lough Neagh, in order to get this implemented. But it has been a problem decades in the making. It will take a long time to remediate and fix. But there is at least a lot of will there, a lot of ideas there, and it's about having those actions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Neil. That was, as I expected it would be, one of the most comprehensive pictures of what's going on in Lough